Okay, so now whenever we're ready, we hit start broadcast. So if you're ready, Scott?
Yeah, I'm ready. We've got 50 participants. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, Robyn, we're pushing start broadcast.
All right.
Here we go.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, welcome and thanks for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Scott Kirsner, editor and co-founder of Innovation Leader. We'd love to get your participation throughout the webinar, so if you can look around for the chat window, let's start off by just letting us know about your role and your title by using that chat interface, and maybe also if you want to share on what industry you work in, that would be great to know. So I'm Scott Kirsner from Innovation Leader. We are a website that collects resources and case studies for executives who work in R&D, new product development, strategy, and innovation roles. We also host live get-togethers that we call Innovation Leader Field Studies, and our next one happens October 21st and 22nd here in Boston, where we'll visit the innovation labs of companies like CVS Health, Microsoft, and iRobot, and also visit startup spaces like Greentown Labs and Cambridge Innovation Center. You can find out more about that at innovationleader.com and just look for the yellow box at the top of the page.
Great, and I'm Robyn Bolton. I'm a partner at Innosight. So Innosight is an innovation and growth strategy consulting firm that helps leading companies really figure out what their growth strategy needs to be so that they can continue to successfully grow into the future instead of being disrupted by the market that they're in, but then also build the capabilities required to achieve that strategy and even the new businesses that could come to define the company in the future. And as a partner, I lead our consumer and retail practice and have done quite a bit of work on all of the topics that we're about to talk about today.
Awesome. Thanks, Robyn. And as I mentioned, I'm in Boston. Robyn's in Stockholm, so we're having a transoceanic webinar today. So we put together this benchmarking survey starting last fall, actually, and fielded it in the fourth quarter of last year. We really designed it for simplicity because we wanted to get a lot of responses from senior level folks in new product development and innovation and research and development. So there were 25 questions. There were not a lot of follow-up and essay questions, but we just wanted to kind of paint a high-level picture of what's happening at innovation programs, mostly at large companies. So you can see that almost 44% of the respondents are at companies with greater than $10 billion in revenue. About 21% said they have less than $1 billion in revenue. So really pretty sizable respondents. The biggest clusters of responses we got were in consumer products, technology, healthcare, and insurance. So let's dive right in and touch on some of the data that came out of this survey. I'm going to kind of talk about the data. Robyn's going to offer some color commentary on what she sees in working with large companies. We asked about program structure, and the way we define that is there a central office or functional group that's responsible for innovation and doing new stuff at your company, or would you describe it more as a distributed initiative where you might have innovation champions or people sprinkled throughout the business units who maybe do some innovation training or are running idea challenges or that sort of thing. We found half of the respondents said, well, we have a hybrid approach, doing a little bit of both. So Robyn, is that kind of what you see in your work with large companies?
That's very much what we see, and I'd say we see actually companies moving more and more to the hybrid approach because there's benefit of having innovation both centralized and distributed. In the centralized group, that's where you can really pursue the transformative innovation, the disruptive innovation, those innovations that don't fit with the current business but are necessary to be successful in the future. Whereas in the business units, you still have to innovate in your core business and come up with the next generation of things, improve your current business. And so that type of incremental and adjacent innovation is really best pursued at the business unit level. So a hybrid approach, great to see that it's about half of the respondents, and we actually see a move continuing in that direction.
And I guess what I would say about the drawbacks of centralized, the issue is that, you can be perceived as this insular group. You're the skunk works, you're the, cool kids off in your own room, and the risk that you run there is people think, okay, that group takes care of innovation, and there can be some hostility towards the ideas that come out of that group, hostility or disinterest to those ideas because they're perceived as not being organic, maybe not being connected to real business issues. But the risk of a totally distributed approach is that sometimes it can feel like, well, who is the person I go to, or where is the real sense of energy around innovation? It kind of exists in pockets throughout the company. So let's talk about program. Go ahead, Robyn.
No, I was going to say absolutely. It's the recognition that there are different types of innovation, and you need different structures to support that, and that's eventually what leads to the hybrid approach, because you want all of those types of innovation to be successful.
Great. So next we asked people about how they describe their innovation program focus, and we again saw that a lot of people said we have a hybrid approach where we're thinking about both near-term and incremental and line extension, so existing products in new packaging, and then also the hybrid would include people who are thinking about transformational or breakthrough innovation, getting into new kinds of businesses, developing products for entirely new customer segments. And it's interesting that the people who said they're focused only on transformational innovation and breakthrough innovation, less than 15% describe themselves that way. So obviously we're seeing a lot more focus on that kind of incremental improvement, innovations that can be rolled out within a year, 18 months, 2 years.
Yeah, and I would say this is actually, it's a pretty good split. I mean, it shows what you really want to make sure is that you're doing the right innovation in the right place. And, so if the incremental adjacent innovation is happening close to the business, that's exactly where it should be happening, because that's where you're getting the real-time feedback from the market. And that's where you're able to, act and affect change as quickly as possible. The transformational breakthrough stuff, that is truly a long-term investment, and it's not going to be generating revenues, massive, significant kind of slope-changing revenues for the business within the next 1, 3, or even 5 years. So you don't want to have a disproportionate number of resources allocated to it. A small idea, still trying to find itself, still trying to find its business model, still trying to find its product market fit. You want a small team working very quickly on that versus a cast of thousands. So, the ratios definitely kind of feel right for what the survey said they were trying to accomplish.
I guess I wanted to touch on, one of the issues when you're trying to do this hybrid, like, yes, but we also want, really just can just be a little bit of, create conflicts within, are we devoting enough attention and resource disruptive stuff, or are we getting pulled entirely to let us be a consultancy to the business units and help them fill in, a gap in their product line for next year. And so the way I kind of did it is it's hard to be this works thinking about, thinking Elon Musk-like thoughts about, how do we get to Mars? And so, and also low-cal version of Wheaties onto store shelves next year. I mean, do you see some of that conflict when people try the hybrid approach, Robyn?
I would definitely see the conflict if, in companies that are trying to treat all innovation the same and have it done all by the same team. And what inevitably happens is what you alluded to, is that all of the innovation gets pulled very close to the core. And you're always working on the next, to use your analogy, the next box of Wheaties, the next box design, the next flavor of Wheaties, and you never touch on the truly transformational or breakthrough innovation. So that's why you need, different teams for different types of innovation, and those, different teams for different types of innovation sitting in different places in the organization that are reflective of kind of what that innovation team is expected to deliver.
Okay, great. So not necessarily trying to do it all within the same team or the same office?
No, that never works.
So we kind of tried to define a spectrum of maturity, and we asked people about how mature, how far along their innovation program was. And the spectrum basically went from ad hoc, which is often characterized by projects happening here and there, as opposed to a true centralized or really strategic program. It may be an innovation day that happens one year but doesn't happen again. The next stage we defined as emerging, where there might be an individual or group that's responsible for innovation, but there isn't really a formal tool set or systems or procedures that have been put in place. Defined, we sort of define as a program that has reached a level of stability. People in the organization know about it. It has a level of support. It's kind of starting to put in place basic processes and communication throughout the organization. The second to most mature phase we called integrated, where you're really starting to see some productivity kick in. There are good ties to the business units and their strategies. As Robyn was referring to, you might have business units working and focusing on incremental product innovations, but a particular innovation group that's thinking about transformational further out stuff. But you're starting to see results pop up, and you have some case studies you can talk about. And finally, the most mature stage we called optimize, where you really have a tool set that people know how to use, a well-oiled innovation system, repeatable processes. You know how to jump on products quickly, get resources for them, and kill them off just as fast, ideally for rational reasons as opposed to just political reasons. And so, we saw more than half of respondents put themselves in the first two immature buckets of either ad hoc or emerging. And the smallest chunk there at 5.1% are people who said we're optimized. You can see on the right there the industries that said they consider themselves sort of early in their journey. And surprisingly, the more optimized, this was surprising to me at least, the more optimized and integrated programs came out of the consumer products industry. And that's where you have companies like Clorox or General Mills that have innovation programs that they can talk about being, 10 plus years old. But also industrial manufacturing, some of those respondents also said they were a little bit further along. Robyn, your take on this?
Yeah, I think the data kind of illustrates two things. One, in terms of the maturity of innovation programs, I think it really reflects the evolving understanding of the discipline of innovation. So 20 years ago, innovation groups were kind of where companies threw the folks who didn't quite fit in, that they didn't quite want to get rid of. And so it's just this land of misfit toys doing stuff. And as the understanding of innovation as a discipline, of the power of it as a business driver and a way to create value, has increased and kind of entered the popular media, entered the business lexicon and the business training. People are starting to see it for the value that it can be and for the discipline that you can put around it to really make it something that is as thoughtful and as predictable is a strange word to use with innovation, but it's something that can truly be a discipline, and have started putting in place innovation programs and kind of learning as they go and learning as the discipline evolves. Over on the right-hand side, the second point this data is making is really about, I think, the impact of contextual changes in an industry as a driver to how quickly innovation programs get put into place and kind of go through the maturing process. Highly regulated markets like healthcare, like banking and capital markets, can feel very safe for a long time because you're regulated and that kind of keeps things stable. But then you have a major crash like in 2008, or you have a major event like the implementation of Obamacare, and that changes the game within the industry and creates a huge need for innovation. Whereas, consumer products, they're always with the consumer is always evolving. There's not regulation that maintains the status quo within CPG. And so those companies have to kind of constantly be innovating, constantly be thinking differently, anticipating or following the consumer. And same thing even with industrial manufacturing. They're not with the consumer, but they're very, very heavily affected by changes in technology. And so that is really a big driver of their need to innovate, to stay ahead, to catch up, et cetera, that probably leads them to also have increasingly mature programs.
Yeah, and we definitely have been seeing just anecdotally a lot of financial services companies. John Hancock is the most recent to launch innovation programs in the last year or two, where I think they're seeing startups doing things in mobile payment and financial planning, and there's banking startups like Simple that has been around for a few years. And so I think they're kind of reacting to a lot of the disruption they see in mobile and web-based financial planning and money management and payments, and saying, okay, it's time to really invest here and build a team that's thinking about what's next. So we want to talk about one last slide and then open it up for kind of a first Q&A, and there are already some questions that have come in, but we asked people about team size and budgets in the survey. You can see on the left side of the slide here, 3.3% of respondents say they have more than 500 employees on the innovation team, and the way we read that is that they're talking really about a research lab or an R&D group in bigger companies like a pharmaceutical company or an aerospace company where you might have hundreds of researchers. But the vast majority described innovation teams where you have, if you see the aqua colored chunk of the pie chart, the purple colored chunk of the pie chart, fewer than 10 employees on the innovation team, so relatively small teams. And on the right side, if you look at those red bars on the bar chart, working with pretty small budgets, most people talk about their budgets for staffing and for events and for other programming, for ideation tools as being under $500,000. So, we think it's fair to say that a lot of these teams are a handful of people spending probably under $1 million on their various initiatives. And again, that doesn't really include a big traditional R&D group at, say, a Boeing type company or a Microsoft type company where you have obviously much bigger budgets and bigger teams. Robyn?
Yeah, I think here you're exactly right that defining kind of what people put into the innovation team is important, because R&D is could by one person be viewed as everybody in R&D is part of innovation. Somebody else would say, well, there's a special group focused on innovation within R&D. But I think the key thing here is that it's really, as we talked about earlier, it's about having the right structures for different types of innovation and having those teams sit in the right places. It's also really about having the right size team for the type of innovation that you're going after and the right budget for the type of innovation you're going after. So the more transformational the innovations you're going after, the more you really want to look like a startup. And that's a really small team, very, very resource constrained so that they are scrappy and creative and hungry and chasing down the business they've been asked to build. For the more incremental, those teams are going to be a bit larger. They're going to be working in a way that is much closer to the processes of the core business. And so they need to look a little bit more like the core business for that reason. So those teams tend to be a little bit bigger, have a little bit bigger budget. And that's just reflective of what's required to work within the organization. So again, it's just being very intentional about, okay, what type of innovation are we going after? What is then the appropriate team size? And then what's the appropriate budget, but then also the most appropriate way to make those funds available.
And I would just add, the corner that a lot of small teams with small budgets can get painted into at the very beginning of their life is, you have the budget for one tool, like an idea collection, sort of idea challenge tool, or one event, like let's do design thinking workshops throughout the company. And the results of using that tool or the results of that event can be, let's say, like not astounding. And the result is then people say, well, the group hasn't done all that much. So so it can be that we see a lot that being set up where the hurdle is just very high to show, okay, with these 3 people and a couple $100,000, we can have impact in a $10 billion company. I don't know if you see that situation as well, Robyn.
Yeah, fortunately, we're seeing it less and less where companies view innovation as kind of this one big event that magically transforms everybody into skilled innovators and suddenly results in, dozens, hundreds of multi-billion-dollar ideas. I think more and more companies are realizing that, again, innovation is a true discipline and it requires day-to-day work by dedicated people to make something happen.
Great. Well, we have some more data to share. Let me not skip over this slide, but I'd also love to get to some questions at the midway point here. This last data slide before we tackle some of the questions that have come in and some of those that we hope you'll ask is just looking at the sources of ideas. One thing that struck me as good news is, you look at the senior management or executive management, and add up those first couple segments, the red, yellow, purple segments of the bar chart. Luckily, a lot of people saying we're not getting most of our ideas from, the CEO or the CTO or the COO handing us a pet idea of theirs. That's a pretty good thing. Employees, ideas, the innovation, creating some of their own ideas, and also not a lot. I mean, if you're looking for the blue and green segments in that customer and partner line, not a lot of ideas coming from customers and partners. I'm not sure what you make of that, Robyn, but it seems to me like potentially that's an issue of, of insularity and maybe not kind of truly being open to open.
I think it's open innovation is definitely one of those things that we hear a lot of companies talking about, and a lot of expressed desire to do that. I think the reason those bars are are the size they are is because it's something that's really hard to activate, and there's a lot of concerns around protecting IP, around giving up core capabilities. So there are concerns that crop up when you talk about open innovation, especially with customers and partners, that don't crop up when you're talking about sourcing ideas from kind of within the walls of the company. So it's one of those things that, again, as the culture of innovation, the understanding of innovation increases and advances, I think we'll see those bars shift as well.
I hope so. So let's get to a couple questions here at the midway point, and then we have a little more data to share, and we also have some of the high-level takeaways from this survey. So Robyn, I'm seeing some of the questions over here on a screen. Question one was asking about transformational innovation. 14-15% of companies that were focusing mostly on transformational, and the participant is asking, is that mostly the biggest or mostly the smallest companies? I'm not looking at the data right now, but it is mostly bigger companies that would say, yes, we're looking for transformational companies. Although we saw some smaller companies or mid-sized companies, Under Armour is one example that comes to mind, where they really do have have a 4-person team that's thinking in the 2 to 4 to 5 year kind of conceptual range, really looking for new products and new market segments for them to get into. Robyn, let me send a question, which is, do you think that Google's recent organizational redesign is an optimal model for large organizations that are looking for diversification and innovation? So Google kind of creating that alphabet umbrella corporate structure. Is that a good model?
I think it's certainly an interesting model and a good model for Google. What I like about that model is the fact that it's recognizing that it has different businesses at different stages of maturity, and also serving very different customers, meeting very different capabilities, and not trying to recognizing those differences, embracing them, and setting up ways that those businesses can grow and innovate differently. But Google also has a very, very distinct culture that can enable that and can kind of, make that work. So I think it's a very interesting model to look at. It can be very, very successful places, but you also need to think about, the culture of the company and, whether that is something that could work for your company and is appropriate for the businesses that you're in.
There's a question about this last slide on the source of ideas, asking about the difference between innovation team and innovation center / lab. I think there's probably a little bit of overlap in the way that people answer those questions, but I think the way we defined it is, an innovation team is, think about the 1 to 5 people that are mostly kind of business people responsible for catalyzing innovation in a company, and innovation center lab being more of an R&D lab or a group of functional experts and specialists, that might be looking at material science or looking at chemistry, and really kind of doing some a group that would do some product development of its own, is my recollection about how we define those two areas differently. Another question for you, Robyn, is about the definition of innovation. We were joking before the webinar starts that question comes up time. So, way of defining that word?
Of course we do. So the definition of innovation is anything new with impact. And we really stress that last part of the sentence around driving impact. It has to do something different. It has to generate revenue. It has to generate profit. It has to have an impact on the business. Now, admittedly, it's a very succinct definition. It's also very general. And that's why you then get into the next question, or the next need, which is defining different types of innovation. So the incremental, the adjacent, the transformational, the disruptive, all of those good things.
Great. So there's a question about success measures. And before we go to the next slide, which actually touches on metrics, I'm curious if you would post in the chat window, if you can see the chat window, or if you don't see the chat window, post it as a question. For you, if we asked you about the metric that's most important to your team and your leadership when it comes to innovation or concepts that are coming out of labs and R&D groups, what would you say is the #1 measure of success here? So you can either post that whichever window you see. If you see the chat window, if you see the question window, chime in. We're opening up those windows here so we can watch. Hopefully, not everybody has both hands occupied by eating lunch or taking care of their email. So customer satisfaction, revenue is an answer. I'd love to get a couple more if you haven't already punched one in. And then we're going to go on to a few more data slides and then some concluding slides before we wrap up. Revenue generated from new offerings is another metric. And feel free to keep chiming in with your #1 metric. Number of failures, client interest, sales, we're seeing people enter as metrics. So what we found was that the #1 metric that people are using really is revenue generated from the products, the services, the ideas that an innovation team is considered responsible for. A close second is the number of projects in the pipeline. So sort of looking at that as an activity metric of how many things are you developing, even if they haven't yet made it to the market. A lot of people using stage gate metrics, profit and loss impact, or other financial metrics kind of tie up to the revenue metric. And then down further on the list, you see things like patent applications or patents granted, IRR, and earned value analysis. Not a lot of people looking at media references or press mentions. So obviously a lot of financial answers here. Robyn, I'd love to get your take. I mean, the thing I would note that we hear a lot from people who are trying to look at sales and revenue as a metric is that, often there's a handoff at some point where you hand off an idea to the business unit or to the sales team, and they take it to market, and it can be hard to collect revenue about, well, how many customers does it have after 2 or 3 years? How much revenue is it responsible for? And and can the innovation team both track and get credit for the revenue they've produced? But I don't know if you want to talk about that or talk about some other aspect of metrics.
Absolutely. So metrics are absolutely tricky, just as you mentioned. And when you have a structure where an innovation team hands off a business to kind of the core business and say, okay, here you go, we've created it, we've tested it, we've proven that it's a viable business, now it's your turn to scale. There are a lot of questions around, okay, how much credit should the innovation team get for what happens once they've handed it off to another team? And the answer is it really does depend on, again, on the culture of the organization, on the metrics that are used to evaluate people. There is no perfect answer. I think the most important thing when we talk about metrics is really making sure that you're using the right metrics to assign to either the right type of innovation or, even more importantly, the place in the pipeline where the innovation is. Because if you start putting revenue in as a metric too early, it's going to drive a lot of behavior that is potentially very, very detrimental to the innovation. If you're looking at a transformational innovation and you say, within a year, we need to be at, and I've seen this happen, at 250 million in revenue, transformational innovations don't transform companies in a year. And so putting a huge revenue number on something in a short period of time is going to, just by necessity, lead people to try to create something that they can get into the market very, very quickly with a lot of great certainty and confidence so that they hit that revenue number and they get their incentives and rewards. So again, this is something where, what is the type of innovation? Where is it in terms of its development? Is it still a nascent idea? Is it in testing, or have you proven out the business model? And then picking the right metric based on the answers to those questions.
So one of the participants wants to know, how long will a project be considered an innovation? So sort of how long does the innovation team get credit for the revenue? And we didn't ask that question in the survey, again, because we want to try to keep it simple. But anecdotally, I would say we talk to a lot of companies where you get credit for something being new for, I would say, about 3 to 4 years. Is that about what you see, Robyn?
Yeah, I'd say 3 years feels about right.
Yeah. And let's see, there are other people chime in with other metrics. Degrees of consumer habit change. So how are consumers doing something different, or maybe shifting over to new products or new ways of using products. Employee engagement. One of the participants says, before the product is released, we'd look at employee engagement and buy-in to the innovation program. So, are people participating in your training sessions, in your idea challenges, your innovation days? And I think there were a few more if we can scroll up. New sales ratio, new sustainable business growth, percentage of revenue from new offerings and ideas in the pipeline. And then again, elaborating on failure, you should be measuring failures because you need to have lots of failures if you want to have a few big successes, which is certainly true. A lot of the interesting data that came out of the survey was about who kills projects, why projects get killed, and how much is spent up to the point where you decide, like, gee, this project, we don't think it has much potential, or we don't think customers are interested. And that list of the top 7 or so reasons why projects get killed, you see the top one, business units just aren't bought into it. The second one is a pretty logical reason of it just was technically unfeasible, it wasn't working. 3, the response of limited upside, I feel is a little problematic because, as Robyn was saying, often some very big ideas can be $1 million ideas in the first year. And so you can look at that in the first or second year, or you can look at it even before the launch and say, gee, that's something that doesn't seem like it's going to have much upside in a $10 billion company. But as with everything, look at Airbnb and Uber in their first or second year. Was it obvious that those were going to be huge businesses? And then again, you see buy-in as we move down the list. No senior buy-in was a big reason. And finally, conflict with existing business units. So it's something that they think might, cannibalize, be priced in a way that challenges their business. It offers something different to customers that are already, quote unquote, happily buying something today. And then Robyn, before we get your take on this, on the right side, big chunk of people, almost 24%, said they're not sure how much gets spent on projects up to the point where they're killed. But the darker blue chunk there is people saying, almost 33% of people saying, we're keeping the budget relatively lean, whether it's voluntarily or, or just because of their circumstances, and spending less than $25,000 to the point where they decide this project isn't going to fly. So your take, Robyn?
Yeah, I think as with everything, there's good reasons to kill a project and bad reasons to kill a project. And certainly technically infeasible, that's a great reason to kill a project. If you can't do it, don't keep trying to make the impossible possible. As you said, limited upside is a bit concerning. I think the other one that raises my eyebrows is the conflict with the businesses. And if these are projects that were chartered to be truly transformational, truly disruptive, create new businesses for the company, they will usually create a conflict with the business. But that should be okay, because the intent of a transformational innovation is to transform the business, and there will inevitably be conflict there. So if conflict is cited as a reason for killing something, that something probably shouldn't have even been started, because there wasn't the true leadership commitment to see it all the way through. And again, this goes back to, let's be very, very intentional about what is the type of innovation we're going after. Let's put the team in the right place. Let's make sure that they have the right champions. And then getting over to, how much you spend on a project, it's a lot, it's a much better conversation to make a $10,000 mistake than $1 million mistake. So when you're doing something that is truly transformational innovation or disruptive innovation, something where you have far more assumptions than knowledge, that's where you want to spend as little as possible to learn as much as possible, and really act like an entrepreneur who's kind of strapped for cash, because that's how you'll learn, and that's how you'll be able to kind of quickly cycle through the ideas and really hit on the big idea, the next Uber, the next Airbnb. But a lot of times we see companies say, this is going to be a big business, so here's a big budget, and that leads to all kinds of weird decision making and weird behaviors.
For sure. I want to go to this next slide about who's killing projects. And if you look at the longest bars there, you'll see an innovation committee is often giving the thumbs up, thumbs down decision on, does this project have a future? And on the bottom, other C-level executives, so not necessarily a chief innovation officer or chief executive officer, but we often hear about innovation teams that report to a SVP of research and development. Maybe they report to a chief marketing officer or chief operating officer. And so you can see there the major cause of death is one of those executives just deciding the potential just isn't there. And as we note at the bottom, many respondents said there's more than one factor in terms of deciding whether a project is going to live or going to die. I should also add that we found in the data that smaller companies let projects live longer than larger companies do. It was about, when we asked about if it takes more than a year to decide whether a project should be killed, 75% of smaller companies said, yeah, that's true. Only 25% of larger companies say that, yes, it takes us more than a year to make that decision. I can't decide if that seems like a positive or a negative. I mean, it has maybe positive and negative dimensions that larger companies are kind of looking for a quicker cycle time, or the negative, I guess, Robyn, would be that they're not giving stuff enough of a runway to prove that customers want this and there's some potential.
Right. I think it all comes down to why is an idea or an innovation being killed, and less about who does it and less about how long it takes, but really what is the why behind that. Because sometimes it honestly takes, a year or two to hit that point where you've learned, and then you've hit that deal killer moment where an assumption you made turns out to be fatally flawed. But you couldn't have reached that realization, a year earlier. Same thing with who is killing the idea. We've actually seen a lot of companies very, very successfully adopt the idea of an innovation council that essentially acts as a venture board reviewing the innovations. And where there's disagreement in the council and a champion emerges, that actually we've seen save a lot of businesses that if it was just a single individual giving the thumbs up or thumbs down, a project would have died. But because a champion emerges from a council, it keeps the project alive, and we've actually seen a lot of those projects go on to be very, very successful businesses.
Yeah, and that definitely seems to be the productive way to set up a committee or a council where, there are people there with budget and with the motivation to adopt some of the ideas and champion some of the ideas. The flip side of that is the committee or council that only says no. That there's not enough of an incentive for them to move stuff ahead, or kind of falls into the vortex of kind of constant analysis, or go back and test this assumption, and it's a committee that is theoretically a green light committee, but it only stays on yellow or red all the time. We have a lot of good questions. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, but that's also a good sign. If you find that you have a committee of no, that actually is a symptom of a deeper rooted problem around a commitment to innovation on the part of senior leadership. So if things aren't, passing the committee, if things aren't passing the people who've been tasked with innovation, then it's a fair question to ask of, is the company really willing to walk the talk?
Yeah. So a lot of good questions and observations that I want to get to. We have two wrap-up slides here of the key challenges that emerged from this survey. Let me just touch on these three, and then I'll throw it to Robyn. The first challenge is just trying to do a little bit of everything, which people do. They're an innovation group. They want to experiment, but really over the long term, we think that you need to pick a couple programs. You need to pick a couple tools, methodologies, a couple ideas that you really want to support, rather than sort of staying at the all-you-can-eat buffet over the long term and just not having that much of a noticeable impact on the company and its culture. Challenge number two was the idea avalanche that you get often when you set up an innovation program and you put up a website, or you have a suggestion box in some way, and you get deluged with ideas, which then forces you to devote all your resources to sorting and sifting through ideas and routing them to the right place. So figuring out how to often focus ideas and create challenges that are sponsored by a particular business unit or a particular functional group within the company, where they want ideas around a particular opportunity that they see, or a technological shift that's happening, or a problem that they have, and really trying to avoid saying like, hey, what ideas do people in the company have? And the final point on this slide is finding ways to build support among the business units and throughout the organization without getting bogged down by too much bureaucracy, which obviously some of the participants have pointed out that bureaucracy and politics have a huge effect on innovation. So, Robyn, I'm not sure if you want to talk about sort of how you get buy-in without it slowing you down, or the other two ideas on this slide.
Yeah, certainly the need for speed in innovation, and speed not necessarily in getting to market and getting to scale as quickly as possible, but really learning as much as you can as quickly as possible is absolutely critical. And that's why, again, when we talk about transformational or disruptive innovation, we say that because that type of stuff is going to conflict with the current business, one of the reasons we saw for things getting killed is those types of innovation, the disruptors, the transformational, those need to be championed and need to be owned at the highest levels of the organization. Because when you have the CEO saying, this team is going to figure out how to disrupt our business, that eliminates a lot of the process and the bureaucracy and the things that can be used to kill the work. Now, again, if you're talking about the other side of the equation and, innovating package design, that's so close to the core that, you do have to deal with some of the processes, et cetera, that go with that, because you're trying to slot into a bigger machine that really is optimized to do scale as well as possible.
I think before we move on to this last slide, we often hear when we're talking about innovation committees and innovation councils, we often hear, look at they meet quarterly, or maybe they meet monthly. And so I do think people are trying to figure out ways, and some of it really just gets down to the hand-to-hand combat of like visiting executives in their office and getting those 5 or 10 or 15-minute conversations on a daily, weekly basis, just so you can keep the momentum up and not be waiting for the big meeting that's going to give the thumbs up or thumbs down to your idea. So a lot of this is the ground game, and I think is companies still trying to figure out. I don't know that there's really a solution that you can package up with a bow, but trying to get more startup-like, where startups are just not having a lot of meetings, but having these continual conversations where everybody stands up in the morning and reports on kind of what they're doing, the problems they've run into, the data they're gathering, as opposed to sort of creating the typical company process where, it's monthly meetings or quarterly meetings and a lot of stuff gets bogged down in between those. Let's go to these last 2 points, and then we've got a lot of questions to touch on. Companies really need to start, one thing that emerged here is companies need to really get better at getting customer feedback, external perspectives, market data as part of the process of deciding what should live or what should die. It's one reason I think you hear a lot of companies talking about the lean startup methodology and ways to inexpensively put stuff in front of customers, even if it's not finished, even if it's not polished, and using that customer reaction rather than corporate politics and executive biases as a way to decide what needs more budget, what should move to the next stage. And then finally, avoiding developing a measurement regime that, squashes real innovation. So, you've over-instrumented your innovating data you're doing rather than delivering results that senior management really cares about. Robyn, do you want to chime in on those two issues, and then we'll get to some participant questions?
Yeah, I'll just touch on, because we've already talked about metrics quite a bit, I'll just touch on number 4, the fly or die, and this point around gathering more external perspectives and market-based data. I mean, at the end of the day, what you should do in terms of a business is far more important than what you can do, and what the market wants is far more, and what the market thinks is far more important than what you think. And we see so many companies saying, well, we have these capabilities, let's just go do this, and we think this is really cool.
Yeah.
Well, if no one's willing to pay for it, you're wasting resources. And so it's really, really important to have that customer centricity, that outside-in perspective, and realizing that ultimately the market is going to decide whether this is innovation or not, whether it has impact or not, and you need to always, really be centered there.
Yeah, I would point out, just to build on that a little bit, we've heard from a couple executives recently, I think most recently the Chief Innovation Officer at Dell's Services Group, that the more that you can put concepts in front of customers and talk to them at trade shows and customer council meetings, and even sort of floating ideas in the press of, here's a technology area that we're really interested in, or here's a market that we're really interested in, and kind of build that external interest and momentum. He had a really, the Chief Innovation Officer at Dell had a really interesting comment about kind of the pincer approach to kind of having lots of constituencies outside the company that are interested in talking about some new direction and can help you make the case inside the company that, geez, the customers are talking about this, analysts are talking about this, the press is talking about this, it's obvious that we need to go in this direction. So a lot of questions here. One that I thought was we've touched on a little bit, but it seems like you're still not addressing the issue of inter-business unit politics. Most disruptive innovation projects are killed simply because of politics. I would say yes, that's true. Robyn, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yes, that is true, and that is why innovations that don't fit cleanly into a BU, those are the ones that run into the inter-business unit conflict. Those are also the ones that need to be centralized, and those are the ones that need to be protected by senior leaders. But those are also the ones that, quite honestly, benefit the most from having an innovation council providing oversight and input. And we look at actually how do you include the business units in that council so that the conflict comes out at the council level, so that a champion emerges early, and those issues can be brought to the surface and resolved sooner in the process rather than later. Because absolutely, I mean, politics are a huge issue, and so you want to think about what can you do to bring those politics to the fore as quickly as possible.
There's another question about CFOs, and what's the most convincing argument that works with CFOs to provide different success metrics for innovation teams working on disruptive innovations? What would those metrics be specifically? And obviously, to stereotype, CFOs want to, see revenues that, probably want to see revenues more than anybody else in the company. I think the question is around, as you're cultivating stuff that may need a long incubation time, Robyn, what do you think you can show the CFO to say, yes, we're going to deliver value to the company? It just may not be something that's in it yet.
Yeah, CFOs certainly do want to see revenue as much, if not more, as anyone in the company. They also want to minimize risk. And that is where the concept of the small teams, the small budget, running small experiments. So you quickly kill an idea after investing $10,000, then spending 2 years, millions of dollars with a big team to kill an idea. And so it's around framing the argument to the CFO of this is a risk minimization approach. And it's small, it's entrepreneurial, it is rapid, and we're actually working to kill the idea as quickly as possible with the least amount of investment, so that when it comes time to cut the big checks, there's greater confidence that there's big revenue coming.
Yeah, and I think in different companies, different CFOs have different levels of influence and authority. And, we certainly talked to companies, Lowe's, the home improvement retailer is one that comes to mind, where, their Lowe's Innovation Labs report up to, I think, a CIO that oversees their budget, and they're explicitly told, we want you to be looking for things that are going to change the way our stores work and change the way people shop in 5 or 10 years, and we're not going to put analytics on it that say, how did this change our revenue next quarter? Even if you were rolling out a prototype into the store, we're just not going to apply those conventional retail metrics to it. So sometimes you need that air cover from another executive that's going to hopefully not have the CFO trying to trim your budget every quarter. So a couple questions. How do you tackle an incumbent traditional R&D director, I think is the question. I have one who sees innovation as fluffy cultural stuff and to pay lip service to that distracts from his research program. So that's kind of an interesting question about a company that might have a traditional as its mission and there's an innovation program around it that is seen as just fluffy cultural stuff.
Yeah, it's funny. There are always the innovation naysayers, and they often have good reason to feel that way, because a lot of times, we saw this more in the past than we do now, but we talked about it already on this webinar in terms of, companies thinking that you have one big idea jam session or you have one big training and you call that innovation and nothing happens, and that very much leads to kind of the cranky innovation naysayers saying this is fluffy, this doesn't matter, this doesn't work. And it is possible to persuade them otherwise, but that is, it's the proof of the pudding is in the eating. You have to show them that innovation can work, can deliver impact, can build revenue, build the business. And we even call those things demonstration projects. How can you get those quick wins to demonstrate that innovation is real and not just a fluffy, feel-good, fun thing? Now, much easier said than done, because you actually need the team and the resources to start the demonstration project to get the results to change the mind of the naysayer. But again, that goes back to how do you start with a really small team so that you're not commandeering 10 people from R&D or consuming 10% of 100 people's time. How can you get one person from R&D to join a team that is starting up a new business to demonstrate that innovation can work at the company and can deliver impact?
Yeah.
So it's a small ask to change the mind.
So I want to mention, we want to get to one or two last questions in our remaining minutes. I want to mention from the innovation leader perspective, we have a September research report that's coming out that's going to focus on recruiting outside talent to corporate innovation teams. And later this year, we're planning to look at building productive and constructive relationships with the business units. So if you have thoughts on that and you want to participate, you can send me an email at editor@innovationleader.com. Great question here about what are the personal incentives for individual team members doing innovation versus project incentives. Typically, these are not necessarily aligned. So I would point out that, as much as companies talk about wanting to be entrepreneurial, one of the biggest challenges that at least public companies have is really giving employees a stake in an idea, an equity stake in an idea, and saying, if this turns out to be the next great thing for our company, not only will you get promoted, will you get more influence and authority, but there's going to be an economic, commensurate economic reward in the same way that a startup member gets a reward when their companies do well. But Robyn, do you have some quick thoughts on personal incentives for individual team members?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I still vividly remember a meeting we were having with a large athletic goods client, and we were talking about, okay, this team is going to work across silos for the first time, and it's going to fundamentally change the business model. This is truly transformative innovation. We need to act like a startup. And one of the people on the steering committee raised his hand, and he said, why should we act like a startup unless we're going to get incented like a startup? And it stopped all of us in our tracks, and we said, you know what, very fair point. But it's very hard for big companies, as you said, Scott, to deliver on that, to give somebody equity stake. So what we found is that, in good or bad, however you want to describe it, is that the people who are drawn to working on innovation, a lot of it is very internally motivated. They want to create something. They like to push the boundaries. They get a rush and personal satisfaction from breaking the rules and testing the boundaries and trying to do something different and kind of slamming themselves into the brick wall of the core business day in and day out. And they see the experience as a reward, plus the promise of promotion and all of those things laid out. So until big companies can actually incent people the way startups do, you have to find those people who the hard work is actually its own reward.
Yes, yeah, but creating that example or the poster children of, hey, you were involved in a successful project and you're now running a new business for us, or you're now, an SVP or an EVP, that obviously creates an incentive. I would say we do see people trying to build some kind of innovation criteria into people's annual performance reports, and making it a factor in bonuses, but that tends to be I think a small dollars impact for people. We're just about out of time. I mean, one last very quick question about, person makes the point, don't you think how quickly and cheaply innovations can be rolled out or tested heavily depends on the industry? And yes, that's true. You're not going to be, spending $10,000 to test a new implantable, cardiac pump or something like that. The point that I would make, though, about testing stuff quick and cheap is that often it's a psychological thing for the company where they don't want to put something with rough edges in front of a customer. They want it. They want to have spent $1 million on design and on the package and on the presentation before they get the feedback that, oh, we don't want this from the customer. And so I actually think there's a psychological or cultural change that can happen to make things testable in a faster, cheaper, dirtier way. Robyn, do you want to have a quick swing at that, and then we'll wrap up?
Yeah, I completely agree with what you said. I'd also say that one of the things we strongly recommend is, especially in the early days, is instead of trying to test the entire business, is really about taking the scientific method approach and test individual assumptions. And that, when you test an individual assumption, it's often, regardless of what industry you're in, a cheaper test to execute. So if you get down to kind of the very detailed assumption around, case in point, we were working on the cardiovascular initiative and say, okay, people will know how to apply the blood pressure cuff. That's a very, very specific assumption. You can test it. We tested it in 3 days for $0 and found out we were wrong. So it's getting down to that granular level can also help speed the testing regardless of the industry.
Great. So we want to thank everyone for participating in the webinar, for all the great questions. If you're registered to participate, you will get a copy of these slides and a recording of the webinar automatically. You'll see on the last slide here Robyn's email address, my email address, if you have questions or that weren't answered perhaps for either of us or other follow-up. So thanks all for participating. Robyn, thank you for participating.
Thank you, Scott.
All right. We'll hopefully see you again soon for another webinar. Thanks a lot, guys.